Tensions between the United States and Iran have entered a new and volatile phase as Tehran confirms it is keeping diplomatic communication lines open with Washington, even while President Donald Trump considers strong responses to Iran's deadly crackdown on anti-government protests that have shaken the country from Tehran to provincial cities in recent weeks, turning domestic unrest into a defining international crisis with far-reaching economic and geopolitical consequences. The protests, sparked initially by deepening economic hardship, unemployment, rising food prices, and widespread frustration with political repression, have evolved into nationwide demonstrations demanding structural reforms and greater civil freedoms, with videos circulating online showing large crowds chanting against senior Iranian leaders, defying heavy police presence and government warnings. In response, Iranian security forces have intensified their operations, deploying riot police, Revolutionary Guard units, and intelligence officers to suppress the unrest, leading to dozens of reported deaths, mass arrests, and the near-total shutdown of internet services across much of the country. Iranian authorities insist that their actions are necessary to restore order, accusing demonstrators of being manipulated by foreign intelligence agencies and hostile governments, particularly the United States and Israel. Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei has framed the protests as a national security threat, describing them as a coordinated campaign aimed at destabilizing the Islamic Republic, a narrative repeatedly echoed on state television as justification for the crackdown. Despite this aggressive domestic response, Iranian officials have signaled that they are not closing the door to Washington. Tehran has quietly conveyed through diplomatic backchannels that it remains open to communication with the United States, portraying this stance as a gesture of strategic restraint meant to avoid an uncontrollable regional escalation. Iranian diplomats emphasize that while the government will not tolerate internal disorder, it seeks to prevent the crisis from spiraling into direct confrontation with the West at a time when its economy is already under intense pressure. In Washington, President Trump has taken an increasingly confrontational tone, describing Iran's actions as unacceptable and warning that further violence against peaceful protesters would trigger severe consequences. He has publicly stated that the United States will not remain silent in the face of what he called a brutal suppression of fundamental human rights, and he has made clear that all options remain on the table, though administration officials stress that the White House is not considering ground troop deployments. One of the most significant tools now being wielded by Washington is economic pressure. President Trump has announced a plan to impose 25% tariffs on countries that continue to do business with Iran, an extraordinary measure designed to isolate Tehran not only through direct sanctions, but by punishing third-party states and corporations that maintain commercial ties with the Islamic Republic. This approach represents a dramatic escalation of secondary sanctions and could force dozens of governments and multinational firms into a difficult choice between preserving access to the U.S. market or maintaining trade relationships with Iran. Trade experts warn that such tariffs could have ripple effects far beyond Iran. Energy markets are particularly vulnerable, as Iran remains a major oil producer despite years of sanctions. Any significant disruption to oil exports or shipping routes could drive global prices higher, affecting everything from fuel costs to food prices in countries heavily dependent on imports. Manufacturing supply chains, already strained by geopolitical instability and trade disputes, could also face new disruptions as firms attempt to reroute sourcing away from Iranian-linked markets. European leaders have expressed unease over Washington's approach, privately warning that forcing allies into economic confrontation with Iran could fracture long-standing diplomatic coalitions. Several EU governments argue that while they condemn Tehran's crackdown, they remain committed to preserving diplomatic frameworks designed to prevent nuclear escalation and regional war, frameworks they fear could collapse under aggressive U.S. tariff enforcement. Back inside Iran, the pressure is mounting from all sides. The national currency has fallen sharply, inflation continues to erode purchasing power, and shortages of essential goods are becoming more common. For ordinary Iranians, the combination of economic hardship and political repression has created an atmosphere of deep frustration and despair, fueling the very protests the government is struggling to contain. Analysts say Tehran's decision to keep communication lines open with Washington is not a sign of weakness but a calculated effort to buy time, manage international fallout, and prevent the United States from building a unified global coalition against it. At the same time, the Iranian leadership appears determined to reassert control internally at almost any cost, even as images of unrest continue to leak out through virtual private networks and foreign-based news channels. For the Trump administration, the challenge is equally complex. The president must balance domestic political demands for a strong response with the reality that economic warfare on this scale could backfire, harming U.S. allies and American consumers while pushing Iran further toward hardline positions. Advisors are reportedly divided between those advocating for maximum pressure and those warning that isolating Iran completely could eliminate any remaining incentive for negotiation. As this standoff unfolds, the world is watching a high-stakes confrontation that blends internal revolution with international brinkmanship, with Tehran suppressing dissent at home while signaling openness abroad, and Washington escalating economic threats while weighing its next move. The future of U.S.-Iran relations hangs in the balance, and the consequences of miscalculation could reverberate far beyond the Middle East, shaping global politics and markets for years to come.